You still have choices. At least, that's what it feels like. A different job, a different city, a different country, a different life. For a moment, you imagine it. And then something happens so quickly you almost never notice it. Before the picture is even complete, your mind quietly begins asking different questions. What about the mortgage? What about the children? What about the salary? What about your parents? What about everything you've already built? A few seconds later, you're no longer imagining another life. You're explaining to yourself why it probably wouldn't have worked anyway. The strange part is, you still believe you made a choice. This isn't a film about courage, or fear, or taking bigger risks. It's an investigation into something much quieter. The moment when possibility stops arriving as imagination and starts arriving as calculation. Nobody tells you when that change happens. One day, you simply notice that before you can imagine another life, your mind has already decided whether you're allowed to have it. Before we continue, this film is part of a larger investigation called Protocol Multiverse. Punchline Protocol explores the ordinary human experiences we often recognize but rarely stop to examine. Darkside Protocol investigates the hidden systems that quietly shape those experiences. Debrief Protocol connects both perspectives and reveals the larger patterns that only become visible when they are seen together. If you'd like to follow the complete investigation, you'll find every chapter in the description below. Now, let's return to the choice you haven't made yet. There was a time when imagining another life cost nothing. You could picture yourself living in another city, choosing a different career, starting over somewhere no one knew your name, and for a few moments, your mind treated every possibility as equally real. It didn't ask whether it was practical. It didn't ask whether it fit your current life. It simply explored. Somewhere along the way, that changed. Today, you open a job listing that immediately catches your attention. You read it. You can almost picture yourself doing the work. Then, before the picture has time to become a possibility, something interrupts it. You think about the mortgage, the salary, the children's school, the years you've already invested where you are. A minute later, the tab is closed, not because the opportunity disappeared, because your imagination quietly stepped aside to let your calculations speak first. At first, this seems like maturity. Responsible people are supposed to think before they act. They're supposed to consider consequences, obligations, and the people who depend on them. None of that is surprising, but perhaps that's not the moment we should be paying attention to. The strange part isn't that adults calculate more than children. The strange part is how early the calculation now begins. Somewhere along the way, many possibilities stopped being places we visited in our imagination before judging them. They began arriving already accompanied by reasons they probably wouldn't work. We still call them options, but maybe something has already happened before the choice even begins. At first, it seems obvious. The older you become, the more responsibilities you have. Of course, you think more carefully before making a decision. Of course, you weigh the risks. That isn't surprising. In fact, it's probably one of the reasons your life became more stable than it used to be. But then something strange begins to happen. You don't wait for an opportunity before calculating its consequences anymore. The calculation has quietly become faster than your imagination. You see a house in another country, and before you've imagined living there, your mind is already converting currencies. You hear about someone changing careers at 40 and immediately start comparing salaries. You watch a family leave everything behind to begin again somewhere else, and almost without noticing, you begin listing all the reasons it wouldn't work for you. The possibility doesn't disappear because someone argued against it. It disappears because your own mind quietly does the arguing before your imagination is finished speaking. Perhaps this is why so many choices begin feeling predictable long before they're made. We often assume we're rejecting possibilities because we've thought them through. But what if that's no longer the full story? What if, somewhere along the way, thought itself became compressed? Not into better decisions, but into faster conclusions. We still believe we're giving every possibility a fair chance, yet many of them never receive one. They arrive already surrounded by years of experience, responsibility, habit, and memory. Before the future has the chance to become a place you can briefly visit, it has already become a problem your present life is trying to solve. The more you look at it, the less this seems to be about careful thinking. After all, there are still moments when you act without hesitation. You order dinner without calculating every possibility. You choose a movie. You take a different route home. Your ability to make decisions hasn't disappeared. Something else has changed. The choices that once felt capable of changing your life no longer belong only to you. A new job is no longer just a new job. It affects your income, your family, your routine, the people who rely on you, and the plans you've already made. Moving to another city is no longer just moving. It means schools, contracts, friendships, commutes, parents growing older, children growing up somewhere else. Every possibility now arrives connected to a life that already exists. Somewhere along the way, your choices stopped feeling like doors waiting to be opened. They began feeling like negotiations with the person your life had already turned you into. Perhaps this is why adulthood creates such a strange illusion. From the outside, you still appear completely free. No one is stopping you. No law prevents you from moving, changing careers, or beginning again. Technically, the possibilities are still there. But freedom rarely disappears by being taken away. Sometimes it changes simply because every new direction has to remain compatible with everything that came before it. The question quietly stops being, what kind of life do I want? It becomes, which version of the future can my current life survive? And maybe that's the first moment this investigation begins pointing somewhere we weren't expecting. Perhaps this is why certain sentences begin sounding so different as you get older. You can always start over. It's never too late. You can become whoever you want to be. Apparently, none of them are false. In fact, they're probably more true than we like to admit. But listen to what quietly happens inside your own mind the moment you hear them. You don't imagine a new beginning. You begin editing it. You can start over if the salary isn't too much lower, if the children don't have to change schools, if your partner agrees, if your parents don't need you nearby, if the mortgage can be managed, if retirement stays on track, if nothing important has to be sacrificed. Before you've even decided whether you want another life, you've already begun negotiating the conditions under which you're allowed to have one. Maybe this is why the idea of freedom changes so quietly in adulthood. As children, freedom felt like the absence of limits. As adults, it often becomes the ability to move without disturbing everything else. The possibilities themselves don't disappear. They simply arrive carrying a growing list of invisible requirements. Eventually, you stop asking whether something is possible. You start asking whether it's compatible. And perhaps that's why so many lives begin feeling decided long before any final decision has actually been made. Not because the future closed its doors, but because every open door now seems to come with terms and conditions that only your present life knows how to read. Maybe this entire investigation has been asking the wrong question. We kept looking at the choices you didn't make, as if the story began there. But perhaps it began much earlier. Long before a decision, long before a calculation, long before responsibility entered the conversation. Somewhere along the way, your imagination quietly stopped receiving permission to exist on its own. It no longer visits impossible places simply because they're interesting. It rarely allows itself to explore a different future without immediately asking whether that future could survive contact with your current life. And perhaps that's the quiet change almost nobody notices. You don't lose possibilities when you reject them. You lose them when your imagination quietly stops giving them a chance to become real. Perhaps this is why so many adults describe themselves as realistic. Realism sounds like an improvement over fantasy. It sounds responsible, mature, necessary. And often it is. But realism has a habit of quietly expanding beyond reality itself. Eventually, it stops describing the world and begins describing the limits of your imagination. The future becomes smaller. Not because fewer paths exist, but because fewer of them are ever allowed to become real inside your mind. And maybe that's the strangest part of all. The future wasn't reduced by the world around you. It was reduced by the conversations your present life learned to have before your imagination even entered the room. Perhaps that's why this feeling is so difficult to describe. From the outside, nothing appears to be missing. Your life may contain many of the things you once hoped for: a stable home, people you love, work that pays the bills, responsibilities you've learned to carry. In many ways, this is exactly what success was supposed to look like. Yet something quietly changes inside a life that becomes increasingly complete. Every new possibility now has to find a place within everything that already exists. It is no longer entering an empty future. It is asking an already occupied life to rearrange itself. And occupied lives rarely rearrange themselves easily. Not because they are trapped, because they have become remarkably good at continuing exactly as they are. Maybe that's why so many people eventually begin describing their lives as settled. We usually hear that word as a compliment: stable, reliable, built. But perhaps every settled life carries a quiet side effect. The more complete it becomes, the more carefully it protects its own continuity. New possibilities are no longer welcomed simply because they're new. They first have to prove they deserve to interrupt everything that already works. And perhaps that's the point where this investigation finally arrives. Your life doesn't begin feeling decided because you stopped making choices. It begins feeling decided because every future choice is now quietly negotiated by every choice that came before it. Perhaps that's why this feeling has always been so difficult to explain. Nothing was taken from you. You didn't wake up one morning without freedom. You didn't suddenly become someone who stopped dreaming. Life simply kept growing. One responsibility became 2, one promise became 10. One decision quietly became the foundation for another. Until one day, without ever intending it, you found yourself living inside a life that had become remarkably good at protecting itself. The strange part is that it happened because so many things went right. The career you built, the people you love, the routines that keep everything together. None of them were mistakes. And perhaps that's exactly why almost nobody notices the moment when the life they created quietly begins helping them decide which futures still feel possible. Maybe your life doesn't feel decided because you stopped choosing. Maybe it feels decided because your imagination no longer gets the first vote. Everything else simply follows from that. And perhaps nothing I said today was new. Perhaps you've been feeling this for years without ever putting it into words. I didn't tell you what to do with that feeling. That was never the point. I only pointed toward something that was already there. The decision about what it means has always belonged to you. I can't decide what this means for your life, because this was never my life to interpret. If this investigation helped you recognize something you've been experiencing without ever putting it into words, there are many more waiting for you inside Punchline Protocol. Every film begins with an ordinary moment, then follows it until something quietly hidden becomes impossible to ignore. Dark Side Protocol explores the invisible systems shaping that experience. Debrief Protocol connects both perspectives into a larger picture. If you'd like to continue the investigation, you'll find every chapter waiting in the description below. Maybe you've known this all along. The ideas are human. The narration is digital. The interpretation has always been yours.